I certainly identify as an entrepreneur more than anything else these days. I sometimes call myself a recovering architect. Often inner urban postcodes will have a higher life expectancy.
Yep.
As you move further away, often lower, not exclusively, but generally.
What's one thing that you'd like to see done in Darwin to really improve the livability of the city? Lucinda Hartley, thanks for joining us on the Next Gen North podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
So what brings you to Darwin?
I am in Darwin this week. I was invited to speak at the Future NT event, which is a forum for business leaders across the Northern Territory to talk about different economic challenges, demographic shifts, and I guess the future of the economy in the Northern Territory.
Okay, is that down at the waterfront that they're holding that one?
Yeah, down at Mindle Beach.
So is, demographics and that sort of thing, are they really pressing issues at the moment? The way, I guess, we've come out of COVID, the way the world's evolving is, do we need to know about how populations are shifting and that sort of thing?
I think it's very interesting, this particular moment in time that we're in right now. Like, demographics are always in the background. There's always societal change going on.
Yep.
But I see that we're at this really pivotal moment in history where we have the combination of a big demographic shift with Gen Z, under 25s becoming a big portion of the workforce, being eligible to vote, having a greater weight, at the same time as we have this technology acceleration and the real acceleration of remote work and digital technologies and AI. So the combination of those two things coming together is having quite a disruptive impact on the way that we think about work, what the future of work and jobs look like, and also the way that we live.
Yep.
And so that's what makes now a really important time to pay attention to demographics.
Right. That sounds extremely fascinating, and I'd love to get into that in a moment. But on this podcast, we like to get to know a little bit about our guests, the personal history side of things. So where are you from originally?
I always have a short answer and a long answer to that question. So the short answer is I'm from Melbourne.
Okay.
But the long answer is I grew up in 6 different countries. I'm what you might call a third culture kid, where I lived in South Africa, Zimbabwe, Kenya, Switzerland, the UK and the US. So I have a strange identity, I guess, in that I feel Australian, but also perhaps can step back and have a critical view of understanding the way a lot of different communities and societies live. So a bit of a mixed bag.
Yep. So was that something brought on by your parents? Were they military families?
That's a common assumption, which is fair enough, but they're actually academics. So my mum's a climate scientist and my dad's a research geologist. And look, I think in nowadays you would just do short trips and do field trips, but in the 80s and 90s there weren't really cheap airfares, and so it seemed logical to move the family around for months at a time while they followed work opportunities. So I definitely still spent a fair chunk of time in Melbourne, but with these other experiences that, were really quite out there for the time.
Wow. So what made you sort of plant your roots back in Australia? What was the driver there?
I think that Melbourne still has a sense of home for me, and that it's my broader extended family are there. It was always the base that we kept coming back to. I mean, as an adult, I've also lived in a lot of other places. I spent time living in Samoa and Vietnam and Cambodia.
Wow.
Worked back in Kenya for the UN for a number of years. So I certainly still have a global outlook, but Melbourne's the anchor, I think, for me if I think about my Australian roots.
Yep. And are you an urban designer? Is that by trade? Is that what you'd call yourself?
Yeah, an urban designer by trade. So that's a broad umbrella profession for the people who shape the strategy behind the cities that we live in. So looking at the future plan for growth for cities and towns.
Yeah. And how does Melbourne rank in terms of urban design and city planning and that sort of thing?
Well, if you follow the Economist livability ratings, Melbourne has historically been number 1 for 7 years it was, and it's been in the top 10 over the past decades as one of the most livable cities in the world. So I think there are parts of Melbourne, particularly the CBD area, that have the structure and dynamics to be an incredibly livable city. The challenge I always have with that kind of view is that if you look at wider Melbourne, like the greater area, which is 100 kilometres across, there are parts of Melbourne that are definitely not livable as well. So we have to sort of consider the whole region. So there is good things, certainly on a global scale, great things that the Melbourne has done, but there are also challenges like there are everywhere.
Sure. Now, would you consider yourself an entrepreneur as well?
Yeah.
So can you tell us about maybe some of the companies that, if not started, you're working with, and some of the initiatives that you're currently working on?
Sure. I certainly identify as an entrepreneur more than anything else these days. I sometimes call myself a recovering architect or landscape architect in that regard. I've spent the past decade looking at new ways to improve the way that we live in cities and to try to address some unmet needs in city environments. So that's primarily been through founding two companies.
Okay.
The first was called Co-Design Studio, and it was a placemaking consultancy. And placemaking is a field of practice that really looks at how we repurpose vacant and underutilized spaces in the city or find new purposes.
Right.
I mean, it's broader than that. It's around collaborative development and putting identity onto places. But the work of that particular company was working with governments and property developers who had, a vacant lot that was perhaps going to be developed in 5 years but wasn't doing anything in the meantime. And how did we have an interim or transitional use that would add new economic and community value?
Yep.
So we delivered over 100 projects across Australia looking at these really grassroots projects. And that then led into what in my mind seems logical, but when I say it out loud doesn't necessarily, a big data analytics startup looking at the way that we quantify and measure city performance.
Okay.
So one of the challenges that I really observed, and so did my co-founder, in thinking about the way that cities are shaped, is you need a lot of data to plan a city. It's complex, right? There's lots of layers. There's traffic and buildings and water and people, but almost all of the data that you use relates to the built environment, like the building heights and the traffic.
Yep.
But actually what really drives value is the people and the culture and the lifestyle, and that's almost invisible. And so we created a platform called Liveability that brings together data about the human experience. So looking at anonymized mobile phone, location data or social media to understand the human experience of cities and use that to drive decisions about retail or what to build where. So I guess, the thread throughout that is looking at like what are the gaps and the new ways that we can create value in cities and improve the way that we live.
Sure. So who is probably a better question with some of your clients? Like, who are you working with, when you build those, I guess, city profiles to find out how efficient they are and, certain pockets of the cities that need work, who are you servicing in that industry?
So in that particular regard, in fact, across the companies I've built, it's mostly been working with the decision makers who hold the levers to drive the decisions about what happens next.
Okay.
So that's either governments who are responsible for the planning of and the regulation and policy around what you're allowed to build where, or it's with the private sector developers who are responsible for the actual delivery of the buildings in those spaces. So providing them with better advice and insights into what to build where or what communities need so that it's more fit for purpose.
Okay. How long have you been in Darwin for?
This time around, I've been here less than 24 hours, but I have been before. Yeah.
So I guess the reason why I ask is, when you look around at the Darwin city, there's a lot of empty blocks at the moment, a lot of boarded up offices. Things aren't really going that well in Darwin City at the moment. So potentially you could look at an empty block that might be sandwiched between a couple of hotels or whatever the case may be. And the work that you do, you could sort of maximize the use of that space to basically bring benefit to the whole community. Is that right?
That's right. You want to look at how to make vacant and underutilized spaces are a really big problem in a lot of cities. They can be a really big detractor, and you want to make sure that they're functioning, that they're attracting people. But it's a common story to have restaurants that aren't doing well or lots that are boarded up. And often it's because we haven't really properly understood what the consumer demand is or what the mix should be. And there can be other factors at play, like what does the rental market look like or the insurance profile. And so looking behind the scenes, what's the mix of the uses? Have we got that right? Are there gaps in what's attracting people that we might need to fill?
Yep.
And then there may be other behind the scenes mechanisms that could be at play, like, it could be that the rent's just too high for the type of use that might go there or something like that can be modified as well at times.
So is there things that policymakers could be doing to, incentivize the better use of those empty spaces or buildings or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of examples of really great programs that have allowed temporary and transitional uses in that space. So perhaps someone doesn't want to take a risk on a 3-year or a 5-year lease, particularly in a space that might be boarded up or not doing well. But there can be opportunities for like social enterprises or not-for-profits or independent artists who are interested in having a temporary or transitional space for 3 months to test out an idea and there's different programs that have been successful. Renew Australia is one that runs programs like that. They work in partnership with governments to help put in those temporary uses, and they can be really effective in attracting people and changing the experience of that place. And once you've got the momentum of becoming a destination, then it's much easier for those temporary uses to roll over into more permanent rent structures as well.
Yep.
But it often takes a transitional phase. And sometimes we want to go to the end goal and we want the big expensive anchor tenant, but actually the offer might not be there for them yet, and you have to build temporary transitional steps.
I 100% agree with that, and I think that that's the stage that we're at, particularly in Darwin, where I've seen certain commercial blocks empty for years, and instead of wanting $1,000 a week for an office, start at $200. Build up that utility, attract. You get the community feel. All of a sudden, there's people eating at the cafe, the coffee shop, and then you can charge the $1,000, $2,000, whatever the case may be. And you sort of build it organically. I think you're right. People are just sort of jumping to the
and there are people who will take a risk on if you're only paying $200 or $100, or might even be free for an amount of time. There are people who might take a risk on a new business idea or a creative program, and it has other benefits to local businesses and the city that are beyond just that.
Yeah, I think that sort of might have been what I was trying to touch on before about the policy levers that policymakers can pull. Because then I think in a lot of cases you get speculators that just want to buy a block, sit on it for 10, 20 years and then cash out at the end. And in my mind, that doesn't really benefit society that much, does it?
No, I mean, particularly housing, but also commercial blocks and others. These aren't just places to work. They have a contribution for the whole community. They fund workers who are going to buy sandwiches from the local store and who are going to attend local events. And we need to see them as pieces of city that are really valuable. And there are mechanisms that policymakers can drive. They can either hike up like vacant land tax would be one to make it like undesirable to keep it vacant, or they can incentivize temporary uses by, footing the insurance or filling the gap in the short term to enable that use.
I saw a really interesting quote. I just want to read it so I'll make sure I get it right, that I saw in one of your presentations. So your postcode is as likely to affect your life expectancy as your genetic code. And I thought that really resonated with me, and I'll get into that after. But can you just tell us a little bit about what you meant by that?
So that quote comes from a piece of research done by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, initially in the US, but the same analysis has been done in Australia, and it also applies. And you're actually able to correlate life expectancy with postcode. So there are certain postcodes that will typically and often inner urban postcodes will have a higher life expectancy. As you move further away, often lower, not exclusively, but generally. And it's as someone whose job it is to plan and design cities, like when I first came across that research 10 years ago, it just hit me like a ton of bricks. Like, how can we be designing cities that actually have this enormous well-being impact as well, either positively or negatively, and what can we do about it?
So the reason why I brought that one up is because there's some research by the Movember Institute of Men's Health, and this relates to the territory that men are 3.5 times likely to die young if they come from the NT federal electorate of, I think it's Lingiari. So that just sort of talks to exactly what you're saying. And I guess that correlates directly with, access to services, geographical remoteness and that sort of thing. Is that sort of what the research tells you as well?
The three areas that would contribute to that statistic, which would definitely underpin that, is that when you think about the different factors of your well-being, there's access to work is one. There's social connection. So what does the social structures look like in that particular neighbourhood? Are you likely to connect with your neighbours? And actually the way that we live, like the built environment, can help shape what those social interactions might look like. And then it's also like other health factors like access to fresh food and things like that. So amenities and social relationships and health more broadly, but fresh food is one that comes up a lot. So I can definitely understand that you do get concentrations of mental health in particular suburbs. Interestingly, like some other research I've looked at in Melbourne has found an increase in mental health in certain outer suburbs, which are more isolated, like they're new development. It's not exclusively all new suburbs, but these ones, they're new developments. Right. There's less jobs. There isn't public transport. People are quite isolated. And that increase in loneliness particularly has also been correlated with increases in family violence. So, these are complex social issues, but they also play out in the way that neighbourhoods are designed. And if we've got better connections, better amenities, better services, then we can start to alleviate those problems to some extent.
Yeah. You mentioned something there that was interesting, was the loneliness component. And I think I hear the term loneliness epidemic that we're currently going through. Like it seems like we're more connected than ever before. And I've mentioned this in other podcasts we've done, but it seems like people are becoming more and more sort of detached from each other. Do you see that in the research you're doing? How has social media had an impact on that? The data that you're gathering, does that sort of talk to that in any way?
Yeah, absolutely. Loneliness is a huge issue. It's probably one of the number one underpinning issues. Like, loneliness is actually, just to talk about all the things that can kill you, but loneliness is as likely to kill you as smoking or heart disease in terms of equivalent life expectancy. Wow. If you've got other loneliness with other comorbidities. So it's a hugely serious issue. And if we want to address it, we need to understand how it works. Yep. So social researchers talk about loneliness in two ways. They talk about it in like the types of connection we need in our life. Okay. So you need strong ties and weak ties, or what might be called bonding capital and bridging capital. So strong ties are the relationships that you'd have with friends and family. They're like strong connections. Okay. And your bridging capital or your weak ties is relationships that you might have with colleagues, or making eye contact with a stranger on public transport, or if you buy your coffee from the same cafe every day, you get to know the barista. These are the weak ties. And one of the reasons that COVID lockdowns were so impactful from a loneliness perspective wasn't that we lost our strong ties, because we still did connect with friends and family. It's because we eliminated temporarily the weak ties.
Interesting.
And when we think about, from a broader neighbourhood context and, the loneliness epidemic, often when people are connecting online, they're connecting either with friends and family or with something that's probably weaker than weak ties, like strangers who anonymously are in the
behind it. Yeah. There's no physical connection. I mean, I'm not trying to say you have to touch someone. No. But you're just not in the same room as them, or So
there is actually a lot of research to say it's extremely powerful just to like go for a walk down a busy street and like see other humans. Like those are things that actually make us feel less lonely. And so we don't get that when we're always online.
Yeah. So we raced a little bit ahead a little bit there. How do you see the fallout of COVID shifting the way that cities are planned in the future, particularly working from home, these sorts of things? How have you seen that trend play out?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important one, and I think we're just at the beginning of seeing what the full disruption of that will be.
Yep.
So I guess COVID has accelerated what was already there, but in a small way with work and flexible work. What it enables is we often get that conversation wrong when we think about work from home. We're thinking about it, comparing a desk in our home compared to a desk in an office, so that people might choose one or the other, or a few days here, a few days there.
Okay.
The real disruption comes when you think about fully remote work. So, running a tech company previously, one of the challenges was that our staff would get poached by companies in the US offering fully remote contracts for 2 or 3 times the price. Like we can't compete with that.
No.
So you've actually got people who can now compete in a global economy who couldn't before. And the impact of that means that you can actually live anywhere. And if you can live anywhere, then where do you choose to live? And so it opens up new markets and new opportunities potentially for people who may not have chosen to live perhaps more regionally, more remotely, because it was too difficult to get to the office, and now work isn't a barrier, so there's more opportunities there. So it can be really important in terms of city planning is that everything doesn't have to be radially in and out of major cities anymore. We can have a much more polycentric or distributed model. But I think we're in the transition phase where we haven't quite got it right yet, and we're just experimenting with different things.
So is that where somewhere like Darwin that's a little bit more relaxed, a bit more easygoing, can sort of leverage that strength as a way to encourage population, migration into the Northern Territory?
Yeah, I think it's a huge opportunity for somewhere like Darwin.
Yeah.
Because if you're thinking about the lifestyle, which is great, right? Amazing climate, amazing things, winter. There's so many different things to do that if proximity to a major office isn't a constraint anymore and you can fully work anywhere, livability becomes that major attractiveness. So Darwin's got a great lifestyle for remote work. And if you think about cities and towns that have been really successful in that, like Byron Bay, Bali even, I mean, they have a slightly different offering, but Darwin can equally be a remote work anchor like that.
Yeah. So can poor city planning in that sense stifle development as opposed to facilitating it? And I guess the example that sort of comes to my mind is we've got many small towns in the Territory and even more remote communities. A lot of them have town the planning schemes.
Yep.
They seem a little bit counterintuitive to me because if you've got an empty lot that's zoned a certain way and someone wants to do something with it but they can't because they're restricted by this almost arbitrary town planning zone, that block will then sit unused, underutilized for decades, like I sort of mentioned before. How do you sort of see more, the more bureaucratic, centrally planned side of things getting in the way of development?
Zoning was invented to segregate nefarious uses from residential uses if we look at its history. So back in the day when industry was heavily polluting, you didn't want to live next to a battery factory or a chemical factory that was putting pollutants in the river. So we created zoning to keep that away from housing.
Okay.
Right. But these days, your work might just be you sitting at a computer. So being next to an office actually isn't necessarily a problem. So I think we need to massively review how we think about mixed-use planning.
Yep.
And it is starting, and there is definitely much more movement around having integrated uses rather than segregated uses. Like it doesn't have to be a CBD over here and residential over here. Like why can't we live together? You know, that all makes sense. They do it in lots of cities around the world very successfully. So I think it can stifle. But it should encourage, particularly if you're thinking about how do we attract more workers to the Territory? How do we attract more talent? You've also got housing affordability challenges like in most major cities, but certainly in Darwin that's there too. But things like zoning can really help with that as well. They can unlock different housing supply, different housing typology. Might mean that you've got to build taller and that, there might be some people who are not happy about that. But there's, more holistic picture.
Okay, so reforming something like town planning could be a way forward for somewhere like Darwin. That's maybe a little bit more archaic in the way that it plans its city. Yeah,
I think town planning can be a huge lever. It can be a huge incentivization. The system is often really slow and difficult to change, unfortunately.
Yes.
But if you are able to unlock it and create new incentives, then it can really work. And I think one of the great success stories in that case is a project called Postcode 3000 in Melbourne in the 90s, introduced by Rob Adams at the City of Melbourne. And at that time, no one lived in the CBD. So it was a donut city, they would call it. So there was big office buildings and restaurants that were only open at lunchtime, and then everyone lived in the suburbs. And it was dead and awful at night. And this initiative called Postcode 3000 was about introducing residential into the CBD and letting people call that home. And so there were, I forget the number, but thousands of apartments built over a 20-year period. And now it's a 24-hour city. It's totally lively. There's lots and lots of people who live in the CBD. And so it's actually a much better outcome for everyone by having the mixed use rather than having them separated. So, Darwin's a very particular place. It's got its own character and identity. But I think thinking about what particular mix of uses need to be there can really increase the vibrancy and attractiveness.
Does that sort of align with, I read something, I don't know if you'd written or if it was another presentation about residential suburbs are transforming into local home-based business precincts. And this kind of resonated with me because I own a small market stall at Mindle Beach Market.
Amazing.
Yeah, so I've got a trailer that I take home, and I essentially use my home kitchen to cook the food that. So like there's a dual use. I've got my home as well as my business from home. So do you sort of see those things aligning?
Yeah, and this is again like when we think about work from home, what comes to mind probably is office workers like sitting at home on a laptop. But actually work from home means, running a photography studio, a hairdresser, a trade out of your home.
Yep.
Right? And when we look at digital data, which is really powerful in this space because it shows us all of the micro businesses that may not necessarily show up in the, census statistics. When we look at that kind of map of a suburb, you think it's residential, but actually you see all these businesses there. Mm-hmm. But our housing hasn't perhaps caught up to the fact that our homes aren't just for living, they're also for working and running all kinds of businesses from.
Yeah. So when you talk about aggregated data and that sort of thing, how do you I think you said, you collect it from mobile phones, things like that. How do you collect that data or aggregate it or centralize it in a way that it's usable? And, is there privacy concerns people have over, big when someone says big anything, like draws connotations to big brother, big pharma, big tech, big data. How do you sort of collect that data in a sort of safe and confidential way?
Yeah, there's lots of different ways to collect data, and the first thing to think about, especially if you think about it from a Liveability's perspective, is looking at behavioural data, not personal data. So behavioural data means what are the footprints that we leave behind about where we go anonymously. So your phone is tracking where you go all the time, your phone company. I mean, sorry if that's news for everyone, but that's true. Now, if I was to look at me individually, that's highly personally identifiable.
Yeah.
But if I look at that at a population level, like the herd level, with hundreds of people, like what are the trends and drivers? It's anonymous, but it gives you interesting patterns into what's popular and not. So you can aggregate and anonymize and de-identify data in a way that helps you understand the pattern, the trend, without understanding any of the individuality around it.
Yep.
So you can do that with business information, with pricing information, with movement information, and it starts to give us an insight into the lifestyle and the character without it compromising privacy.
Okay. And does that sort of data, does that plug into the idea of a smart city or a 15-minute city? We'll try start with 15-minute cities. Maybe if you can explain what you know a 15-minute city to be, whether you think it's a good idea, a bad idea, whether there's benefit there to society.
15-minute cities is a concept actually first described by Melbourne's 20-minute planning city.
Is that right?
They called it 20-minute cities in Melbourne.
What year was that? Sorry.
So recently, probably about 10 years ago, a team out of the Department of Planning in Melbourne had a 20-minute city initiative.
Because I thought it was a UK thing.
Yeah. So they then copied and made it 15 minutes. And Paris really popularised it with the Ville du Quart d'Heure, like the 15-minute city with the mayor of Paris.
Right.
And many other cities have taken it on. But the concept is basically this, like, do I have everything I need to support my daily life within a 15-minute walk?
Yep.
Walking being the operative word there, or a 20-minute walk, which is about a kilometre.
And that almost goes back into like a pre-industrial revolutionary time. Yeah, like everything, that's how cities and towns were designed, right? Because there were no trains, trams, motor cars, that sort of thing. So everything was in 15 minutes of your house.
That's it.
Yeah.
So these days it's what we ideally want to see is that, do you have access to childcare, schools, supermarkets, food, work, all of the basic things that you might need, healthcare, within walking distance.
Yep.
And that is really important, coming back to that earlier conversation around your life expectancy and your, how your postcode can drive your life expectancy. If you live in a 15-minute neighbourhood, you're likely to live longer because you've got more access to services, you're more likely to walk.
Yep.
And so what we want to see ideally is that there are 15-minute cities everywhere. So it's become a planning policy, if you like, to try and incentivise or encourage having enough amenities close to home.
Yep. Some people might draw parallels to the COVID lockdown and the 15-minute cities.
Yeah.
How do you sort of see that? How do we mitigate those sort of negative viewpoints of where people might think, the 15-minute cities sounds great in theory, but down the line they might use it to try and restrict our movement, change the car we drive, that sort of thing. How do you think we can overcome those sort of
I think it's actually quite hilarious. Never before have I seen like urban planning become the conspiracy theory, which it did in lockdown in that way.
Yeah.
I mean, you're allowed to leave, right? Yep. So having everything you need within walking distance doesn't mean that that's the only place you can go. And obviously, like, lockdowns are very controversial. They're very restrictive. They had a huge mental health impact. There's lots of repercussions that are falling out in that. And, I lived through the 260 days of Melbourne's lockdown or whatever, so I can relate to that.
Yeah.
But the idea of it from a planning perspective means, if everyone has that close to home, you're going to be better off. But it would only be a problem if you weren't allowed to leave.
Yeah.
And it's not a control tactic to get people
just to play
pay.
devil's advocate a little bit, I think in the UK they were talking about fining people, if you did drive your car across, just out of your boundary too many times or something like that.
During COVID or
No, just as a principle of the 15-minute city. So I think that's maybe where those sort of negative parallels got.
Yeah. I suspect in the UK where they have congestion tax charging and other things like that, it might be a lot like it's not what it's designed for, but I can understand why people make that association.
Yep.
I think in the UK where they're trying to emphasise public transport, so saying driving, you get taxed if you drive far, but it'll be free to get the train or the bus or the tram or whatever other alternative.
Yeah. So smart cities. A smart city uses ICT to enhance livability, workability and sustainability. Can you tell us about smart cities and maybe what the distinction is between a 15-minute city and a sort of a more holistic smart city?
Yeah. So I guess to recap, a 15-minute city is really talking about the physicality of the neighbourhood and the proximity of the amenities.
Yep.
Smart cities is generally a term referred to the technology that might enable the functioning of a city.
Okay.
I don't like that term.
Smart city?
Yeah.
Oh, really? Why is that?
Well, to me, a smart city would be one that's about people and well-being and puts that at the centre as the objective.
As opposed to just numbers, ones and O's and that sort of thing. Yeah.
And I'm a believer that technology is an enabler, absolutely. Yeah. But I think sometimes we can get overly excited that technology is the solution for everything and it can be an enabler, but we've really got to still make sure that we are counting people and well-being as the overall goal, not efficiency necessarily.
Yeah.
So, smart cities have got a lot of advantages. I think it can help us understand patterns and trends that we didn't know before, identify new solutions. I think some of the issues we're talking about before about things like planning being powerful but also slow and complex, like technology and AI can massively unlock a lot of that. But I think there are other, if we took that to the extreme and we see what's happening in places like China, I guess, where they've got facial recognition software on the video cameras. So, you've got less anonymity and, I think there'd be arguments that people would make that that's a positive use as well. But I you can quickly see the nefarious uses that might happen if you lose privacy and, control through technology as well. So I think there's a fine balance to thinking about the role of technology in how we plan and design cities.
Yeah. So is there like some sort of, passive agreement that when you go into a city that you potentially might have your personal information utilised in that sense to try and, I guess, contribute to a greater good? Is that sort of how you see it? Or
Well, I guess I would like that to be transparent. And one of the projects that I had the opportunity to work on as an advisor to Google, so Google had a branch called Sidewalk Labs, they still have, which is sort of a city technology development agency, is developing a set of iconography or visual language that describes what kind of data was being collected where.
Right.
So if you see a stop sign, even in a different language, you usually know what it means, like stop. So we all know what that means.
Yep.
So it was about having symbols like that would say that you would recognise to know, okay, there's CCTV camera in this area or there's like people trackers happening in this area.
Sure.
Now, I know that there are CCTV cameras around Darwin CBD.
Yep.
But I just know that because I've worked with the city previously. I don't know that because there was anything on the streets that told me that I was being filmed. Now, I also know that it's anonymous and it's deleted and it's got good data handling, etc.
Yep.
But that wouldn't necessarily be the case everywhere. So, I would love to I'm a believer that in collecting data and tech and that it can really enable our decisions, but I think having public transparency on what's being collected where is important.
Yeah. And do you see any potential problems with data leaks, or if, these systems get hacked, and how we can mitigate against that sort of thing?
Yeah, it can definitely be mitigated. And it is obviously a risk, I think, where we're giving more and more trust into larger data sets. But certainly what most, particularly public agencies, do with that data is they don't keep it. So they might transcribe the video into a movement pattern that's anonymous.
Yep.
And delete the original footage, and that's all baked into the service. So the original footage is never kept. And so that way you're getting the insight without compromising the privacy. And I think in that regard, it's a good use. I think you can take that to extreme and run facial recognition software over the top of it and know where everyone is exactly.
Yep.
I think that starts to really shift the way that we have lived, which has a level of anonymity about it.
Yep, sovereignty.
And privacy and what that means. There's big discussions at the moment around privacy and AI and what that means.
Yeah, so actually that's a good segue. What are the impacts you see AI having in the way we, might plan a city or, urban design? A computer decides where to build a cafe or put a traffic light instead of a human. Like how do you sort of see that? Because that just seems like it's just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger.
So when you describe it, it feels a little bit scary. But then when I think about, do humans make good decisions about where to put stoplights in cafes? No, they don't actually.
Really?
I actually think generally we get it wrong all the time. So I think there's a couple of benefits. One is speed. Like if we can – we're in a housing crisis nationally. It affects everywhere, particularly in Northern Territory, but there's, it's an issue all across Australia.
Yep.
If we can move faster in unblocking planning, in the design and delivery of housing, if we use AI on modular housing and other things like that, we can deliver more than we've ever done before with less cost, and we need to, and that's good. I hope we go that way. I'm not sure that we will.
Yeah.
It can assess planning rules, like rather than having a human compare, the 50-page planning code with a paper drawing and it takes them 3 months. Could be done instantly.
Yep.
You could just have a model put in and go, yep, compliant, not compliant. So we can really increase speed. I also see AI has a huge opportunity in looking at options or optionality. Like, I see city making as a very creative process. It's about coming up with lots of different ideas. I mean, maybe I could come up with like 10 different options in my head, but AI could come up with thousands. And it's still, I think, a human should be involved in deciding like what the best outcome is.
Yeah.
But having options that no one may ever have thought of, like, could actually be really useful.
Yeah.
So I think done well with policy, with ethical constraints, really powerful. I think it's hard to talk about AI without also thinking about some of the ethical challenges and the biases that already exist in large learning models, large language models, sorry, and those, I think we're at this transition time where there's a lot of risks that if you play them out into the future could go either way if we're not paying attention.
So really, at this stage, it's still a tool that, the user is – the better a user is at utilising that tool is going to maximise the efficiency of the AI, right?
Yeah.
It's not AI driven. It's still –
it's a human-controlled AI, and so therefore I think, it's perhaps in a safer space. I do think we'll get into a model where AI makes more and more of the decisions, and then that's probably also okay, but we do have to pay a huge amount of attention to the algorithms and the biases and assumptions and how much we rely on it as well. Like, is it really true just because it was on the internet? There's lots of questions that I think need to absolutely be considered. Yeah.
Looking around Darwin, we mentioned before, there's a lot of shop fronts that are boarded up. There's probably not a lot of cool green spaces in the city. Should Darwin and the north of Australia in particular be looking at somewhere like Singapore for inspiration, or is that too lofty a goal at this point? Or where should we be looking to put our stock into to take inspiration for the development of our own cities in the north?
I mean, Darwin's a hot place, right? I mean, like, there's a good half of the year where you don't want to be outside.
Yep.
Or maybe that's just as a Melburnian, but
No, I'm born and bred, and it rings true for everyone.
trees are great. Trees are fantastic infrastructure. I mean, the Singaporean strategy is quite simple, really. They just want 60 to 70% canopy cover in the city.
Right.
So at that level, it's completely achievable.
Yep.
Of course, yeah, Singapore's really high tech. They have incredible like green buildings and beautiful facades. It doesn't have to be that, but thinking about how do you increase the canopy cover to be, 50% plus across the city, making it really shady and easy to walk. You can reduce the microclimate like 5-10 degrees, make it much more pleasant. That gets people outside walking more. It gets you seeing strangers more. Like it has all of these other benefits as well.
Yeah.
And it's, in theory, a simple strategy.
So if you had a magic wand, there was one thing you could do to improve Darwin City. I'm not sure if this is what you're going to be talking about at your Futures Talk, NT Futures Talk. What's one thing that you could do or that you'd like to see done in Darwin to really improve the urban design of the place, the livability of the city? Is there one thing?
Well, actually, if you ask me that, I probably would say like an urban forest strategy or like greening like that. Yeah, because climate is such an interrelated part of the comfort of the city.
Yep.
And if you want to make, great cities, I think, are pedestrian and micro scale. They've got lots of small spaces like just outside here. We were talking earlier, this podcast is in a laneway with lots of different creative businesses. Those kinds of small spaces are very human scale. Trees and vegetation can create the microclimate for that. So that's definitely one thing that I would think about.
Yep.
But in any kind of city strategy, I always come back to like the core place value proposition. Like what can Darwin be best in the world at? It's such a unique place. I don't think there's anywhere else like it that I've been.
Yep.
And you don't want to become just like somewhere else.
Yeah.
You want to think about, it's like a personality test. Focus on your top 5 strengths and forget about the bottom 5 that you're never going to be able to solve.
Yep.
Like think about like what are those top things, it's creative economy, the mix of spaces, the climate, all of these things have so much going for it. Think about what it can be best at.
Alice Springs, have you been to Alice before?
I haven't, no.
So, I mean, it's probably pretty hard to miss unfortunately, the social upheaval that's been going on in Alice Springs at the moment. Is there a way that, clever urban design and city planning can sort of mitigate some of the social problems that are currently engulfing places like Alice Springs at the moment?
I can talk more generally, having not been to Alice Springs. I'd be hesitant to comment on it specifically, but, I've worked in a lot of really complex places, particularly with my work with United Nations. And a couple of things I think are important. One is like really high quality investment in public infrastructure. So in places like Medellin in Colombia, had a huge problem with gun violence actually in the favelas. And one of the strategies that the city government put in place was incredibly expensive libraries in these favelas.
Okay.
So it was this huge contrast of, slum type living.
Yep.
And then the public infrastructure that was provided wasn't just, bottom tier infrastructure. It was like beautiful community spaces.
Right.
And they were connected by cable cars because you couldn't actually get roads in.
Yep. I've been to Medellin. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Yep.
So completely transformative for these neighborhoods because there was a level of investment and pride in these places.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, I think investing properly and in a community sensitive way in public infrastructure can help. The other thing is I think we often overlook the role of young people. I think young people are often excluded, particularly teenagers who can't vote, have less voice in cities, but often have some of the most creative solutions and ideas, often have no particular places that are theirs to go. And so when you do see issues around young people, I often look at it and go, well, can you really blame people who maybe it's not safe to be at home? They don't have a workplace to go to. They don't have money to spend. So where are you going to be? You're going to be hanging out in public places, but how do you design those places in a way that actually, co-created with young people or have the needs that they might need, whether it's free Wi-Fi, sports, other things that might be useful in those areas.
Yep.
And I've seen great examples in some of the work we did with the United Nations is employing youth leaders as the caretakers of different public spaces.
Yep.
And they then created them as their own and in a way that was really creative and productive.
Yeah. So did you with your work in those remote locations, was there anything that you see that would be effective in somewhere like a remote Indigenous community? You know, Alice Springs is a town of 25,000 people, so it has very different characteristics to a township with 1,000 people.
Yes, absolutely.
Is there a way that, you know, again, city planning, urban design can effectively sort of help people that don't have access to services, don't have access to education and employment? Is that even feasible at that sort of scale?
I mean, yeah, remoteness is always going to be a huge challenge.
Yeah.
I mean, my philosophy in approaching anything like that would be like locals are the expert in the places they live.
Yep.
What do they think is the priority? And look, I can't speak specifically those communities, but only just one really pivotal moment on a project in an area of Cambodia was just and that's a very, very different environment again. But it was just, again, talking about community leadership was there was an assumption that this community really needed a school. And when we worked with the community leaders, they were like, oh, we don't need a school. Like the problem's the flooding. Like we really just need like footpaths and ways of dealing with the drainage. And we reinvested the funding into that project instead and had a really transformative effect. And I just only share that as an example, as I think that local leaders are always the experts.
Yep,
and so if we're, you know, even able to look at, providing funding for people to build their own or to do ways that that what the community identifies as the need would, in my view, always be the starting point.
Yeah.
I hope also in a digital economy that we're more likely to be able to see different services, whether it's drone delivery or online education or so many other things that can open up that weren't previously possible or economically viable.
Okay.
But again, coming at it from the perspective of how do we instill a sense of local leadership and pride in those decisions?
Yeah. So at the Futures conference, you're going to be talking about, I think it was generational change you mentioned it before. Is that one of the sort of broader scale trends you see going forward, really contributing to the way cities are developed in the future?
Yeah, it's always like every generation will define a sense of a lifestyle pattern that then has a reflective impact on how we live and work and therefore the buildings that we need. But I think it's really accelerating at the moment. You know, half the world is under 25.
Yeah. So how do you see younger people really making their mark on the future of cities?
Yeah. So what I'd like, if we think about that from a work context to start with, and, you know, NT has a much higher youth population than the rest of Australia.
That's right.
It's a very young population. I mean, average age, I think 32, but like, you know, proportionally younger.
Yep.
If we think about the impact of a digital first generation and how they think about work or workplaces, the need for office space as we've known it, I think will be completely disrupted in 10 years' time. So right now we're at a bit of a transition phase where we've got lots of elder millennials like me who still go to the office. But like there are people who I think Gen Zs particularly use space very differently.
Yep.
So doesn't mean that we don't need offices, but the way that they function will be quite different in the future. So that's one example.
Okay.
I think we're also looking at unless we've got serious policy finance intervention, a generation of people locked out of the housing market. And so what does that do? So if you're looking at a generation of renters potentially, or people who may have less stable economic outcomes because they're not able to access property ownership in the same way that previous generations have, that creates a different market dynamic around what housing needs to be and needs to do and how people will live.
Right.
Now, I'm optimistic that we can improve it by different models like shared equity finance, like co-living models, like, you know, moving away from this antiquated idea that you have one home and one mortgage, that there can be other ways to fractionalize mortgages or shared equity models that would provide more opportunities for young people. So I'm hopeful that there are pathways forward.
Yep.
But the actual what a home is, what it looks like, you know, whether you're sharing it, whether it's a co-living arrangement, I think the economic dynamics may enable new models to come online that might not have economically been viable before.
Yep. Yeah.
And so when we think about that macro level, where people are traveling around for work, how they're working, where do we need public transport and services, if everyone's like working differently and not necessarily coming into the city, into the office, and if they're living differently, then it does have an impact on city planning and city growth.
Yeah. So do you sort of see younger people maybe as being a little bit more nomadic, for the lack of a better word?
Yeah, likely. And it may not necessarily be by choice either. So I think that that's likely to be true in a work context because work is likely to be more flexible. But if you're not going to be able, if you're assuming, and I hope it's not true, but if you're assuming that you may never get into the housing market and that may never be something that you do, then your likelihood to sort of, well, I'll just go and work in Bali instead may be higher. Like it might be a more likely choice potentially. So the idea that people might move around more, it is being called the most mobile and global generation in history. Yeah.
And that's going to have implications for, older institutions like commercial real estate, right?
Yeah.
The office, like you said, is probably just not going to exist in 10, 15 years.
Yeah, not as we know it.
As we know it now.
Yeah. That's right.
Any other broader trends you see on the horizon?
Well, if we're looking at, I think this is probably relevant for somewhere like the Northern Territory. Like, we are seeing also like a big cultural shift, that it's much more likely that future citizens will speak an Asian language, that more than half of Australians will be born overseas. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population is growing. Particularly in Northern Territory, but, across Australia it's growing. And so, we're seeing like many more different cultures to learn from, reflect on, the different ways of living. So I think that, it's early days, but I do feel that those cultural shifts have an impact on our lifestyle and what we want out of cities and how we live, many, many more influences. And I think that's going to ideally make places much more exciting and vibrant as well.
Fascinating. And that's really covered all the topics that I wanted to discuss. Really, really interesting stuff. Thank you so much for your insights on that. You're obviously very well versed in it all.
Got one of my favourite topics, so it's fine.
We like to give our guests a little bit of a platform just to promote whatever they've got going on at the end of our podcast. So if there's anything you'd like people to check out, a website, an initiative, floor is yours.
So I've my latest initiative is working on a shared equity housing product. So looking at ways to co-invest with homeowners to make housing more affordable, called Mondus Capital. So check that out if you're interested in looking at different ways to address housing affordability. I also do a lot of public speaking and writing and thoughts about future trends. So you can follow me on Substack at Urban Happiness is the name of my blog, or just lucindahartley.com for trend insights.
Awesome. Guys, check it out. Lucinda Hartley, thanks very much for your time and best of luck at the NT Futures.
Thank you so much for having me.
Cheers. Thanks, guys.